Bill Fletcher, I want to see if you could jump in and add to this, and I know there's a lot of different directions that you can go into. You can look at it from an international perspective. You can also look at it from a labor perspective as well. And I bring this up because one of the challenges that we have is that in many cities, some of the laws that people have found to be repressive and that they find themselves on the receiving end are backed by police unions. And oftentimes when we talk about unions, we may say the ACLU, we may say the folks that are down on the docks, and then also we kind of put in there and say, well, we have to back these police unions. Now, when I was in New York, they said that one of the big challenges at the Black Lives Conference, that we're gonna have to deal with police unions, where you have policemen's Bill of Rights that allow people to stay hidden after they shoot somebody, where in some places they're not even talking to anybody, like they haven't interviewed the cop who shot a 12-year-old Tamir Rice, because the law is protected. In Missouri, they tried to pass a law to make sure that you would never know the name of a police officer who got shot, and they're trying to pass this nationally. Now, oftentimes when people protest and they say, we want to get some sort of police reform, the pushback is, well, do it locally. But we know that the Fraternal Order of Police have been trying to pass things, including the Bill of Rights, nationally. And we have a lot of folks that have D's next to their name who champion some of those policies. So maybe, Bill, if you can unpack some of that, unions, labor, how do you differentiate the labor that has traditionally been a pillar in the Democratic circles in terms of elections and all that, with the labor or the unions that oftentimes are, that the police belong to?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. I have an operation on Monday, and so it was recommended that I not travel. So you've given me a lot to talk about, and over the next 5 hours, we'll be able to finish it.
No, you got 30 seconds.
So, and obviously if anyone has to use the restroom, they can do it while I'm talking. Let me start first, though, with a bigger picture piece about foreign policy and race and class in foreign policy. And then, if I have time, I really do want to get into this issue that you were just raising about unions. And the reason I really do want to do this race and class in U.S. foreign policy is that we often separate race particularly from U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's really important that we understand that U.S. foreign policy is governed by basically two things. One is the search for U.S. hegemony. And the second is increasingly protecting the interests of global capitalism. Now, the U.S. relationship to the rest of the world is guided to a great extent by this controversial category called American exceptionalism, which, as everyone remembers, was hotly debated when President Obama was elected, and specifically that he did not allegedly believe enough in American exceptionalism. But we have to understand that American exceptionalism is an incredibly Let me continue. So what I was saying is that American exceptionalism is a really bizarre concept that suggests that the United States is so unique, the U.S. experience is so unique, not simply unique because every nation is itself unique, but it is so unique that it in effect cannot be guided by any international principles whatsoever, that it has to be looked at as something separate, and that U.S. experience trumps all others, and there's no pun intended there. So this American exceptionalism really draws from the settler origins of the United States, and one of the components of that, or several components of that, one is this notion that's inherent in all settler states, that this settler state is God-given to the settlers, that God had a special communication with the settlers and left the indigenous people off the line. A second is the notion of rugged individualism. A third is, and this is very important, that no agreement is to be respected if it does not advance the interests of the state. And this is really important. When you look, for example, at the treaties that were signed with Native Americans between 1783 and about 1883, there were more than, I believe, 350 such treaties, all of which were broken, all of which. A fourth category is the importance of guns and force. A fifth is the very notion of racial superiority that's contained within the notion of American exceptionalism. And this really goes to two things. One is the population that is considered relevant, and the populations, plural, that are considered irrelevant. And even with the growth of what's been called neo-racism, you may get away formally from the idea of racial superiority, but you get into a notion of racial uniqueness. Again, that it may not be that white Americans, let's say, are superior to the rest of the world, but that they're sufficiently unique. So I think that context is really important in terms of understanding U.S. foreign policy. I would add to that a few things, that over the last 40 years, with the emergence of neoliberal globalization, there's been a corresponding growth of a transnational capitalist class. And that we've seen this with the growth of multinational corporations, with trade agreements that obliterate tariffs, and this has had a dramatic impact on issues of national and local sovereignty, which is one of the reasons that the whole struggle around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was so important. Now, let me say a little bit about the implications of all this. One is that with the transformation, particularly the growth of neoliberal globalization, we have a really weird situation where elements of the global south have penetrated into the global north. And the reverse is also true, that we have countries in the global south that have ruling classes that see themselves more directly tied with global capital than they do with their own domestic populations. We see in the United States and in the global north the development of entire regions that are, in effect, economically dead and have become almost the equivalent of reservations. When we look at people like Donald Trump, we have to understand that Trump, as much of a clown as he may be, is not unique globally. You see corresponding political figures in every global northern country representing right-wing populist xenophobic movements that are basically saying, on the one hand, their support for neoliberalism, on the other hand, this real attack on immigrants, particularly immigrants from the global south. And that's where this issue of race, again, becomes critically important. When, for example, Donald Trump talks about immigrants as being a threat, he's not talking about Russians. He's not talking about Poles. He's not talking about Romanians. He's talking about immigrants from the global south, and particularly from Latin America. And so what we've seen in the United States is this racialization of immigration, and that has entered into all of the foreign policy discussions that we've had.
Let's give it up for Bill Fletcher on that. Thank you. It is a lot to take in with what he was saying there, but I think he's spot on, especially when we look at how things get framed and how one group gets demonized, another group is accepted. I call it global gentrification. You know, when you really think about it, living in Oakland, we have folks who never lived in Oakland who are coming from other parts, and they're like, you're all are welcome here. You know, you're gonna make the neighborhood good. And we're gonna invest in bike lanes and, you know, and get new parks and get services, but there's no investment in the people that live there all their lives. And in fact, they're often seen as the problem or they're blamed. And that I see is kind of like a microcosm of what is happening globally. So it's something to think about on a number of levels.